Good evening and welcome to tonight's lecture. I'm George Kraw. Tonight we'll be hearing from Professor Michael Beck, who is the AXA Chair of Coastal Resilience at UC Santa Cruz. For 2 decades, he's been doing cutting-edge work in this very important area. And recent events, as well as climate change, have shown the need for continued work here. Professor Beck, I turn it over to you.
Excellent. Thank you. I have the mic here. All right. Good evening, everybody. Yeah, thank you for coming out in person. Really appreciate it. Thank you for being online. George, thank you very much for the introduction, supporting the series. Much appreciated. Appreciate what you and your family have done. What I want to talk about today are natural disasters. The costs of natural disasters are rising rapidly on our coasts, mostly from poor development choices and climate change. This is putting both people and nature at grave risk. State and national budgets are being increasingly strained in the response to these disasters. But much of that response is funding more artificial infrastructure on our coasts, which only further degrades nature. We could direct much more of this funding to the environment if we can show that nature can be cost-effective in helping to build resilience on our coastlines. I hope to show you that we can, in fact, do that, and with a little bit of disaster jujitsu, that we can turn a grave threat to nature into an opportunity to save it. This work that I'll be describing today is coming from our team of folks and many other collaborators, and so I'm just pointing to some of the folks involved here. I'm an ecologist by training. Our team includes policy folks, economists, engineers, and others, and I've worked very closely in particular with Borja Reguero in doing a lot of this work. Okay. Why coastal protection services? We know that coastal hazards are real and rising. This is Hurricane Michael, Category 5 when it passed over the Florida Panhandle. This is Hurricane Sandy, passing over the Bahamas. We sort of forget that it impacted 20 nations before hitting New York, New Jersey, and the like. So I'm going to be talking a lot about nature and nature-based solutions and the role that nature can play in reducing risks. And so I want to show you just a little bit about how that works. So this is a little bit of a demonstration video of mangroves in a flume. You can see waves coming across. The mangrove forests damp down those waves, and they also hold back storm surge so that by the time you reach the shore, you see very little change in water levels in certain areas. So that's how mangroves and other wetlands like marshes, coastal marshes around here, work to help reduce flooding. Reefs break waves. And so we've shown in earlier work that reefs can reduce 97% of the wave energy that would otherwise hit coastlines. You can imagine if you're in Hawaii and standing on the beach with a Mai Tai in your hand and a little bit of waves lapping up at your feet, and then you're looking offshore at people surfing on 14 or 15-foot waves. That's the coral reef protecting you, reducing that wave energy. And that's the same thing that happens on our coasts here with rocky reefs. So that's why when you're at Pleasure Point, in the neighborhood that I'm from, you can also be watching enormous waves offshore and much less wave energy hitting those coastlines. All right, so I'm going to be talking a lot about the science of assessing flood risk and how we then identify the benefits provided by nature. I'm not going to show you all the equations. You're lucky tonight. But you do need to know that there's a whole series of models that go from assessing waves and water level offshore, connecting those to nearshore models as waves and water levels change as they feel the bottom near shore. Then we take those over habitats, like mangroves in this picture, and then we assess how that results in flooding on shore, either with the mangroves in place or the additional flooding that occurs without those mangroves, and then we assess the consequences to people and property of those changes in flooding. So that's the basis for most of the analyses in one way, shape, or form that you're going to see from me tonight. And what we do with this in terms of maps, and this is an example from Grand Bahama Island. You may have remembered that it was deeply impacted by Hurricane Dorian a few years back. And this just shows an example of the types of maps and the data that we generate, taking a look at what a 1 in 10 year flooding event would look like with mangroves in blue. And then we model what happens if you didn't have those mangroves protecting the coastlines in red. And so you see a lot more additional flooding in Grand Bahama without those mangroves. And then we do the economics. And so the people and the property underneath those red areas are the people and property benefiting from keeping those mangroves in place. And we do this for your 1 in 10 year event, your 1 in 100 year event, and the like. And then after several years of work, we can generate a map like this, which is the assessment of the annual flood reduction benefits of mangroves globally. And so we look at all 700,000 hectares of mangroves around the world, nearly 100 nations, and we can identify where are the hot spots here in red, where mangroves are providing the greatest flood protection benefits to people. And that amounts to tens of millions of dollars per year per kilometer. I've summarized them here in 20-kilometer units, but it's tens of millions of dollars in some of these places per kilometer in terms of those benefits. And we've done the same thing for coral reefs all around the world. And this is around 60 nations, same sorts of analyses. We assess what flooding looks like with the coral reefs in place, what it would be if you lost just 1 meter. So we're talking about the topmost meter of your offshore breakwater, which is the kinds of losses that we are actually seeing from coral bleaching all around the world. And we can show where those losses, that is where reefs at present, are providing the greatest protection benefits, these hot spots all around the world. And that includes many places, and you'll see more about this in the Caribbean, South Florida, and elsewhere. We take this one step further, and we're able to put it together with what we know about the costs of restoration for these habitats, so what it takes to rebuild them. So we put our benefits for mangroves, the flood protection benefits that they're providing, together with information on costs. We think about that restoration project as though it were an infrastructure project, just like we would if we were doing a seawall. And we say, what are those benefits accumulated over 30 years at a certain discount rate? And what you're seeing here are the places where mangrove restoration can return really significant returns on investment, high benefit to cost ratios, sometime greater than 15 to 1 in these large yellow circled areas. So we can identify what are the benefits, we can assess what are the costs, and we can tell you where you can get the biggest bang for your buck in terms of both mangrove, and I won't show you the coral reef map, but we've done it for coral reefs in the Caribbean, where you can get the best bang for your buck in terms of restoration for flood protection. We've done a lot of work with the World Bank. You're going to hear a lot from me about economics, but I also want to note that we also are very particularly concerned about how this affects people, and particularly some of our most vulnerable people. And what we did as part of a project with the World Bank is to assess the benefits of mangroves. And we did that both for property, so this is the same kind of analyses that I was just showing you. This is where mangroves, the hot spots where mangroves, like Manila, are providing the greatest economic benefits for flood protection. But then we also have data from the Philippine government on people below poverty, and we can identify where mangroves are particularly important to the most socially vulnerable populations. And that's what you see over here on this map. So you see some areas that are somewhat the same, but particularly here in the eastern Philippines, a lot more protection to vulnerable people in those areas. And that's important in deciding where we prioritize investments in this kind of restoration, both to protect some of these high-value economic areas, but also our most socially vulnerable. Here in the U.S., we've worked really closely with USGS and the lab there in Santa Cruz to be able to provide really high-resolution assessments of the value of coral reefs all around the U.S. for flood protection benefits. And what you can see here are some of the hot spots where we're providing reefs are providing some of the greatest protection to property all around the country, whether that's in Florida, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, or elsewhere. So we put this together in a government report, and you can see this isn't the flashiest of maps you've ever seen. So we work with some graduate students, particularly in science communications, to develop better maps to help us better visualize, what these might be. And this is one of the products of that work. And what we're highlighting here is these are the reefs that we're calling the $1 million reefs, and in this case, the $1 million reefs of Oahu, where they're providing more than $1 million in flood protection benefits every year. And so that's all of these highlighted areas. And then we're also showing you that if you lost those reefs, what are the areas that would be flooded in the 100-year event? And we did this for Puerto Rico, Florida, a variety of other geographies. These maps were particularly compelling, showed up in the same month, both in the Star Advertiser in Honolulu, but then quite importantly in some work that we do with the U.S. Army Corps in their guidance on natural and nature-based features. That's nature-based solutions, or how nature can help if you engineer with it. So it was showing up both in popular press and in very technical guidance. And just last week we learned that Jesse, who was one of the science communicators involved in that, won a very important award for the National Academy of Science in Science Communication for the kind of work that we did together. And we think that that's kind of very important in terms of getting this work out there. Okay, so I've shown you that reefs and wetlands, whether we're talking coral reefs, we also have examples for oyster reefs, but marshes and mangroves provide important benefits, but they can also be damaged in storm events. So just like our artificial infrastructure, seawalls or breakwaters can be damaged by wave and flooding events, so can our natural infrastructure, and that's never assessed in these recovery efforts, never supported afterwards. And so what we did is we took some data from NOAA and we said, where are reefs damaged after Hurricanes Irma and Maria? And we're looking at San Juan, Puerto Rico, the coastline near the airport in San Juan, Puerto Rico. These are the reefs, and these are the assessments of damage by NOAA after the hurricanes. And so the reefs got knocked down, and so we modeled what was flood risk before those reefs were impacted, and what was the flood risk afterwards. And so what you see here in the white bars is the flood risk before those reefs were damaged, and then all of the bar tops in yellow, orange, and red are the increases in reef damages because you've lost that offshore breakwater. So the damages to our natural infrastructure has real economic consequences in future events like Fiona, which we just passed through. So this gives you a very good idea that we can actually really assess what's being damaged to our infrastructure, and then consequently what that means in terms of increases to our flood risk. And this is central to being able to then fund the restoration of our natural infrastructure. And so then what we did further here as part of these studies is to ask, well, what if you were to restore reefs? And so we took a hypothetical set of restoration projects all along the coastline, and we said, what are the benefits of that restoration very directly? And so what you see here is total risk, so the bar height in this case is total flood risk, and then the blue is the amount that flood risk would be reduced by the restoration of these reefs. So we can quantify the benefits of these reef restorations. And you can see, for example, if you have reefs right near shore, then you can get some quite significant benefits from that restoration. So we're, again, really able to quantify where you can receive these sorts of benefits and where we believe that recovery funding ought to be directed to restore some of those benefits. And this is the type of modeling that I also think, so I've talked a lot about coral reefs, I think we can do some of the same sorts of assessments for rocky reefs on our coastline here. Because it's rocky reefs and those rocky reefs with kelp forests on them that are providing the principal wave protection along our coastlines. And we can take a very similar approach. We've been losing some of those habitats. They've been being eroded away, sand overtopping them, and the like. And so we ought to be assessing what are the benefits that can be achieved from restoration of those habitats. And that's something that we could do statewide, just like we did elsewhere. One of the projects that we're involved in this area is assessing the flood protection benefits that could be provided by marsh restoration in San Mateo County. So we're looking at potential marsh restoration sites throughout the county. The one area that we identified, or the area with the greatest benefits that we identified, is here near SFO. And it's an area that if you restored marshes along this stretch of coastline here, that you could receive some pretty significant benefits in terms of reductions in flooding and flood height. And so then we run the numbers on this and we say, in current events, and if you were just considering a 100-year storm event with current sea levels, the restoration of these marshes would yield a value of around $900,000 per hectare. And that's well above the cost of a typical restoration cost for these marshes. So could yield some quite significant benefits. With just a ½ meter of sea level rise, a very realistic future for us, then the value of that marsh restoration would increase to $9 million per hectare. You're able to protect a much larger area once we're having to combat this kind of sea level rise. Again, the sorts of principal points here are we are able to assess current and future flood risk, and then identify where habitats can contribute to the flood reduction and the kinds of benefits that they yield. This is work that we're doing around the globe right now, projects that we're just starting to really be able to assess not just what current flood risk it will be, but what future flood risk will be, and not just from sea level rise, but also from increases in waves and storms. I'll say just a bit about that in a second. This is some work that we're doing for the National Fish and Wildlife refuges and parks across the Pacific, where we're assessing what flooding would look like with sea level rise. And so you get much more flooding here in the yellow areas with sea level rise. And then we're also assessing what happens if you lose some of your reefs. And this is, if you look on Google Earth, you can see where reefs are providing protection to your coastlines by looking for the wave breaking offshore. And you can even use your little history feature to go, where has wave breaking changed, and the like. So that's the kind of services work that you can do at your home computer, assessing changes. But again, what we're doing here is we're using the latest climate models, assessing future storms, future waves, and really identifying what are the resources at risk. And in this case, what are the natural resources like sea turtle nesting beaches, bird areas, cultural resources on these coastlines, and identifying for the parks and refuges what's at flood risk and what they might need to manage. As I said, we have to be thinking, a lot of people when they think climate change, they think just about sea levels. And you hear that sea levels are changing and that is a very important problem, and it absolutely is. But the kinds of problems that I'm even more concerned about are changes in wave energy. And this is work that Borja from our lab has led, showing that over recent history, wave energy is increasing. And this is the daily attack of waves on our coastlines, on our infrastructure, so that while increases in sea level are a long-term problem, when they're coupled with increases in wave energy, then the lifetime that you think an infrastructure project, like a seawall or a bridge, will be able to succeed against wave energy, those lifetimes are decreasing as wave energy, wave attack is increasing on our coastline, and this is something that we've got to be paying much more attention to. Okay. I've talked all about the dire consequences and where there are benefits provided by these reefs. Our group is a very solutions-oriented group, and so we're trying to take the kind of data that we've been putting together and very directly using it to help inform where we ought to be changing practices, policies, and actions on the ground, both by agencies and businesses and environmental groups. And some of those I highlighted in a recent op-ed. We've got to start including natural assets in national accounting. Right now, our GDP, gross domestic product, is assessed by what we take from the environment. The fish, the timber, the things that we take away, not the value to us of leaving those habitats in place for the protection benefits. We have just passed recent policies in the US that allows us to start accounting for these benefits, and this is work that many of us have been leading for quite a few years. I'll show you an example from that. We need to rethink our infrastructure investments. You may have heard some things in the recent infrastructure policy that are beneficial for the environment. NOAA increases in budgets. But really, that's 1% of these budgets, and 99% of that is still going to gray infrastructure on our coastlines. We've got to use disaster recovery funds better. Here again, in Puerto Rico, despite the fact that reefs are providing really important protection benefits, they have not been able to get money from FEMA to restore those natural defenses on their coastlines, and they've been trying hard. We're helping them. And then we work with the insurance industry to think about how we can design insurance incentives to help protect nature, and we need to be building innovative demonstration projects. So as I said, I've been telling you about the kind of key results that we have, and then there are a variety of areas where we're hoping to directly inform the work that we do with key stakeholders. One of those is working very closely with the insurance industry. So RMS, Risk Management Solutions, is one of the top 2 risk modeling firms in the industry for assessing risks, whether that's for insurance or for bonds or the like. You know, if I showed you our results, despite the fact that they're based on the same models, and I go and I talk to the insurers and I say, I'm going to have to explain to you the model, they want to know all the questions, blah, blah, yeah. If I go and I say, we've worked with RMS and we've looked at the results in their model, and I can tell you what they did, they said, we don't need to know, because we accept what they did as truth. We've already crossed that bridge with them. What we did is we said, well, can you tell us what the effect of marshes is in your risk model? And the first thing they said is, no client had ever asked them to do that before. But they said, we can do it. And so we looked during Hurricane Sandy and found that marshes protected all of these areas in red along the northeast coastline. Reduced damages during Hurricane Sandy alone by some $625 million. We looked in particular at a whole series of storms, as they normally would for one county, and we said, overall, marshes reduce average losses by some 15%. That's at the kind of level at which you could expect premium incentives for doing marsh restoration on your property. So this is the sort of thing that we're working with the industry on. After Hurricane Irma, which also impacted the southwest Florida coast. So you might have heard a lot about Naples and Fort Myers and the like in the news recently. After Irma, we'd also been assessing what kinds of protections mangroves offered along those coastlines. And overall, we found that mangroves reduced damages by 25%. And you can look at the damage photos online, and you can see that those areas behind mangroves, those properties, receive protections. In the insurance models, they actually show the sorts of things that you see. That if you built in front of mangroves, like we did on Fort Myers Beach and Sanibel Island and the like, damages increase. And that's exactly what we saw. So we're building in front of our first line of defense, and we're expecting some other result. No. So we can work very closely with the industry and say, we know and can understand what's happening and what we can do about it. As I said, we've also been working very closely with the World Bank on these national economics problems. And again, trying to figure out how we incorporate the benefits of leaving habitats in place into our national economies. And so what we're able to do is for mangroves around the world is we're able to identify what's the contribution to all of these nations that you see here, highlighted here, in terms of the benefits provided by mangroves in flood protection. And the U.S. is fifth on this list. Mangroves actually provide us quite a substantial amount of overall wealth in terms of flood protection benefits. And we're able to assess these changes over time as well. So, short message here is there is, in fact, a very clear way to include these kinds of values into our assessments of our economies. And we ought to be doing that, and the U.S. will be doing that in the coming years. We worked very closely with the Nature Conservancy and Swiss Re and AXA to help develop a first of its kind insurance policy for nature. And so in this case, as I told you before, reefs get damaged by storms. And so we developed an insurance policy with all of those partners, led by TNC in this case, developed an insurance policy that would pay out in damaging events to the reef. And in this case, it actually paid out after Hurricane Delta. And so you remember that was the year that we went through all the names, and then we were into the Greek alphabet for hurricanes in the season. Well, Hurricane Delta passed over this area south of Cancun, where the reef was insured, and the payout after that event helped support divers and others to go into the water and be able to help restore the reef. Because what happens from that damage is the reef structures there in this wave-driven zone get knocked over. And then they're rolling around in the lagoon. They can survive for about 2 weeks or thereabouts. The reef also gets everything from fishing nets to refrigerators on it. And so you've got to be able to pull those off so they don't do any more damage to the reef and get this back. So this was actually a very successful insurance policy, and it's been expanded to 4 other reef areas in Mexico, Honduras, and Belize. And we're working very closely with the industry trying to develop a first-of-its-kind mangrove insurance, somewhere to be announced soon. We've also been working to develop accounting procedures that allow us to account for the benefits provided by nature. So you might have heard a lot about carbon accounting, where I want to be able to contribute to carbon mitigation, carbon sequestration, and I want to receive credits for that. And California has been deeply involved in the development of those markets for those credits, and there's lots of business commitments to those. But this is a commitment to future risk reduction by helping to reduce the impacts of climate change. We think we should be contributing to current risk reduction. And so we're working to take the kind of data that we have and put it into a standard accounting procedure that would allow you to develop not just a mitigation marketplace, but an adaptation marketplace, so that you could get credits for restoring mangroves and other ecosystems now for the protections that they offer. We're also working very closely with FEMA and trying to change the way that they do their benefit cost analyses. So as I said, folks like Puerto Rico are trying to access some of the $100 billion in recovery funding that was appropriated after Hurricanes Irma and Maria for storm damage. What you need to be able to do is to essentially take your reef restoration project through the official benefit cost analysis. And so we're trying to take a look at reefs as natural infrastructure and do the process with them just as they would. So this is Christiansted in St. Croix. This is the barrier reef here, fringing reef here, reef areas here. And we can take a look at where reefs restoration would provide the greatest flood protection benefits, and that's principally in these areas in yellow here, and we're working all the way through the mechanics of how you would actually use this to develop an application for some of those recovery funding. And next week will be released some work that we did to actually help communities be able to apply for that funding. And so this was a report commissioned by the U.S. Coral Reef Task Force. Austin, who's here as a coastal science and policy grad student, was involved in helping to support and then lead this effort. And this was done with all of the participating agencies you see here. So really important in terms of helping communities with that leg up. Because what we're hearing from lots of places, and this includes places like Santa Cruz, we want to do the right thing. We want to figure out the right adaptation strategies, but we don't have the expertise or the guidance to get there. Can you guys at UC Santa Cruz and other places help us to do that? We just got support from the Department of Defense. DARPA, their advanced research arm, is getting involved in reef restoration to protect military installations. And this is huge. They've just funded 3 $20 million projects to be able to design reefs that will protect some of these military bases and be able to survive in the face of climate change. I'm not going to walk this. This project is led by the University of Miami. We're deeply involved in the design of the reefs. I'm going to show you a little bit about that. But there's many aspects to the design, from the underlying infrastructure to 3D printed intricate designs that allow for larval settlement, biofilms, genetically engineering some of the corals so that they can survive climate change. And we have some very aggressive targets that we need to hit, both in time and the amount of protection and the survivability of these. And I'm going to show you, these are results from last week that I'm showing you here in terms of what we're doing. So this is the flume at the University of Miami lab. We're setting up a reef in there with imitation mimic coral mimics on the top of it. They then turn on a hurricane force set of fans to blow wind and over there, generating the waves. We then take, I'm showing you a 2-dimensional model, but this is actually a 3-dimensional model where we're trying to understand how different shapes of these reefs and structures on top of them affect wave energy dissipation. Ultimately, trying to reduce this pocket of dissipation that you see over here, which is what would be flooding the shorelines. So this is the kind of modeling that we're doing in the lab to understand what are structures that might offer these kinds of protections, and then to prepare for a reef installation next year here at Naval Air Station Key West. So Key West itself is right here. This key is basically more or less the landing strip. And we're talking about reef restoration projects near here to help protect some of these areas. And this gives an idea of the kind of modeling that we're doing there to be able to assess what do waves look like when they're coming into the shoreline. what does that mean in terms of vorticity and turbulence and the flow in these areas? And then we'll start to put in potential designs and be able to assess the protections that they can offer to this military base and military bases elsewhere. And then one of the things that I'm really excited about, again, this is I pushed our student last night to get me this visualization. So what I really want to be able to do is take these visualizations and then work with some of these game engines to say, how can I help better for decision makers understand what wave breaking means on these structures? What does it mean if we lose reefs in terms of waves breaking and changes in flooding at the shore? You don't see the changes in flooding in this, but we're working on that to do that using the same kinds of engines that video gamers are using in their development. And we think that there are a lot of benefit that could be offered in terms of really understanding what are the structures that might be impacted by these sorts of events, and being able to really understand much better what it means to lose reefs and what it means when we're talking about changes in flooding on our shoreline. Another very large project just starting. We haven't even, the funding's been approved, coming in the door very soon, working very closely with Maya Trotz and a team. She and I will co-lead this team to understand climate risks and identify equitable nature-based solutions in a variety of tropical areas around the globe. And we want to be able to empower coastal communities to use these tools, to use nature in ways that are meaningful to them, reducing their risks, contributing to sustainable livelihoods. And this project I'm really excited about, just ginning up. The other thing that you may have heard a bit about in the news is the development at UC Santa Cruz of a Center for Coastal Climate Resilience. And there are leaders around campus working on this right now, and you're going to be hearing announcements soon about that. It's a $20 million investment from the state to help us develop better strategies for building climate resilience on our coastlines. Okay. So if I were to sum it up as briefly as possible, I think hope to have shown you that habitats really do benefit lives and livelihoods, that we can rigorously value these benefits, and by being able to really quantify the benefits to people and property, we can support innovative ways to fund conservation, restoration, risk reduction, and adaptation on our coastlines. So thank you. And I'll take questions now. Yes?
Fascinating talk. Thank you so much. Wait for the mic. Thank you very much for this great talk. Very inspiring. The question that popped into my mind early on your 8th slide or so, when you talked about Cancun and Belize being really important to be protected, and then in the latest slide again, how do you regrow mangroves or coral reefs in practice? How do you do that?
Yep. Well, mangroves are actually, in many respects, a pretty weedy species on coastlines. So nothing else grows very well in that kind of tropical intertidal environment. So as long as you get the hydrology right, and by that I mean the slope of the area. So a lot of mangroves, for example, have been lost to shrimp aquaculture ponds around the world. So you have to go back in and grade those ponds down so that you actually have kind of that intertidal slope, as it were. Once you do that, mangroves often naturally recede, but they also many mangroves have very large propagules that you can actually just plant. Involve volunteers. The Philippines has actually paid, as part of their disaster recovery efforts, supported communities to go out and plant mangroves. And again, you can get these big propagules and you can do that kind of planting. And other folks that we partner with have shown that mangroves can grow back within 5 years, just from seedlings. But of course, you can also nursery grow mangroves, and so you can put out saplings or trees and get benefits along that front line of mangroves very quickly. So that happens very, very quickly, and we know how to do that. Tens to even hundreds of thousands of hectares of mangrove restoration around the world. We are farther behind in coral reefs, and that's why Department of Defense is getting involved. There really had been, up until some of the most recent bleaching events, there'd been this kind of assumption that, well, reefs will recover. They'll be able to do it. We don't need to get so involved in restoration. And some of the more recent bleaching events have said, no, we actually are going to have to get much more actively involved. And in terms of coastal protection, you do that kind of like I showed in the images, where you get back some structure that you've lost. So that might be some form of an artificial structure. And then you usually plant corals on top of it. And you can grow those corals in a nursery. So corals naturally break off. So you see those big branching corals. They're in some of those high wave energy environments. They naturally break off. They naturally roll around. Some of them will get lodged and start to grow all on their own. You can use that, essentially, that evolution to essentially take nubbins, that's what I call them, and grow them in a variety of places. And reefs have evolved in wave-driven environments. We've got a lot to learn from them about protecting ourselves in wave-driven environments. You got to apparently wait for the microphone. Oh, we're going to do an online question, and then we're going to come back to you.
We're going to do a question from the Zoom chat, which is that... Okay, sorry everyone. We're going to do a question from the Zoom chat, which is that mangroves and reefs are important and good context for your work, but what are key issues you could target relevant to California and the interests of our policymakers here?
Yep. Well, again, the equivalents of reefs and mangroves, coral reefs and mangroves in the tropics are our rocky reefs and our marshes on these coastlines. Here in California, we've lost a huge amount of marshes. Some of those, you always hear about the really tragic losses in Louisiana. Well, on a percentage basis, we've lost more in California over time. Those marshes from San Francisco Bay and in Southern California. So those marshes are offering lots of protections in our bay environments. And I think that we've underappreciated as a state the protections that rocky reefs are providing on our coasts. And that includes, I'm sure many of you have heard about cliff erosion in Pacifica and other places along our coastlines. A lot of those are places where we've also been challenged by some of the impacts to our rocky reefs. And we need to do a better accounting of where we can work with those to help protect our coastlines here. And that's work that we're beginning. The one behind you.
About the rocky reefs in California, one of the things that's happened over the past 5 or 10 years, you may be aware, is we've lost a lot of the kelp covering the reefs. And intuitively, I could imagine the kelp helping reduce wave energy. Have you done any modeling or study about that?
Yeah, so the kelp themselves do not do a lot of wave energy reduction. And, the best example I can kind of point you to is, I go down to Pleasure Point and everybody's surfing just inside of the kelp beds. And that's because the kelp is taking off a little bit of the wind chop, but not reducing the waves. So not doing a lot for wave energy. If we want to do something about wave energy, then we have to think about what's been happening in somewhat shallower waters and thinking about the actual structures on the bottom that are doing that wave breaking. Because when you're looking at that wave breaking offshore, you can do just a little bit of kind of quick math and know that if you see, where you see about a 7-foot wave breaking, well, that's giving you a pretty good idea of what the depth of water is in about that spot there. And so you can kind of assess, where am I receiving some of the greatest wave breaking benefits? Where might that be changing on my coastline?
One more from the Zoom chat. Since coral reefs take decades to build and climate change is destroying them, are artificial reefs the wave of the future? And then relatedly, What do you think of coral reefs being made in labs and put out into the sea? I've seen this, and I'm curious if it's good for the environment.
Well, first, I should point out that I worked for the Nature Conservancy for 20 years. I love natural wild places. We should be protecting first. So wherever we can be protecting, I am certainly an advocate for putting in those protections in place, saving what we got. Because when we have to be restoring, then that means it's going to be more expensive. And we're still learning in a lot of places how to do restoration well. Reefs, we need to start thinking about reefs as essentially a thin living skin on top of a seawall that they've secreted. So what you see from a reef there is tens to maybe hundreds of years of secretion of this limestone, and then you've got this thin, living, colorful skin at the top. So what we can do is assist in the recovery of that structure where we've lost the structure. That delivers the protection benefits quite quickly. Where we're least far along is understanding how to get back that living skin as best as possible. Because in the end, what we'd like that to look like is a natural reef. And this is why, yes, in lots of labs, and this is a lot of community-based effort as well, growing corals, figuring out how to grow corals more quickly, that are more resistant to some of these changes in water temperature or acidity, plant them on corals in different ways, and really be able to get those back. So I think in the next 10 years, much like we saw for a lot of, say, oyster reef restoration, you're going to see a lot of advances in materials. You're going to see a lot more 3D printed materials and the like that we can use as more natural substrates for the base, and then a lot more advances in what we can do to get corals to survive out, corals that we raise either in the field or in the lab to survive on these structures.
I'm interested in San Francisco Bay, and I don't think that we have any corals or mangroves in them. So how we deal with sea level rise, and how do we deal with the putting a levee in which the is naturally resilient to climate change?
Right. So in the bay, what we have are marshes, like the example I showed you. So marshes are the mangrove equivalent. You get marsh wetlands in temperate environments like we're in, and they transition to mangroves in tropical environments. So we've got the marshes. We've got, for example, efforts to use those as horizontal levees, where we're growing marshes out and able to get some of that wave breaking and surge reduction through that marsh restoration. In some places, we are able to also, the bay used to have a lot of oyster reefs. There's a lot of debate about exactly how much of that was natural and how much of that was all of the shellfish aquaculture farms. But there used to be a lot of, for example, oyster reefs. On the east coast of the U.S., and efforts I was heavily involved in, we went from doing oyster restoration projects like the size of this front row of seats, meters long, to miles-long oyster reef restoration for protection projects in places like Texas and Mobile Bay. Also near military installations there are part of the DoD project that we're involved in. So it's going to be using the temperate equivalents, oyster reefs, marshes inside of our bays, things like rocky reefs offshore on our coasts.
Two more questions also with local interest. Someone in the Zoom chat lives in Capitola Village and is curious about what opportunities are available for this type of work there, as it's high risk for climate change. And someone also asked about how your work can deal with wave events like tsunamis, like the one we had in Santa Cruz Harbor.
Yep, Capitola. Again, I mean, there is some rocky reef protections there. I mean, so I would probably, at least from a nature-based solution standpoint, be assessing some of those. There's lots of other things that we can do on our shoreline, and again. None of these things, none of what I've talked about should be taken in isolation. I don't think that some nature-based solution is going to reduce all of your risks. Risk reduction is always about a combination of strategies. Some of those risk transfer and insurance. Some of those are going to involve artificial solutions, some natural solutions, and some thinking about where we're developing in the first place. And we've got to stop putting people and property in harm's way that we ultimately pay for in our taxes. So we've got to be much more sensible about that, and it's going to be a combination of these nature-based solutions together with some of those. Tsunamis. Tsunamis are in many ways a much more difficult problem, but if I was down in the harbor, when the tsunami from Japan came in, and you could see what little bits of marsh that were back in the back of the harbor were actually doing a little bit to dissipate some waves, where we've essentially built a concrete wall around the whole thing, and like we did up in Crescent City in the harbor there, when waves enter there, all they do is slosh around in a bathtub basin in there, doing more damage to all of the boats. So having softer shorelines at the back of some of these areas can certainly be one of the things that we can do to help. But again, I will point to tsunamis are a quite substantially different problem. People need to think about a tsunami as more like a tide than a wave. We sort of think of it as a wave when it really has much more long wave characteristics like a tide. And they're obviously much less common, so they're quite a bit harder to understand the behavior of, because we have so many fewer events to kind of understand what to expect in those extremes. We got in the back.
Hello. I was very impressed by the science communication graphs you used during this presentation, and I wanted to say, good on that, because I really do think that kind of science communication will help with, I guess, getting your point across to people that aren't necessarily in the science, so to speak. And I also was curious with your the particular example you used with the game engine. What game engine was used to create that, and was it accurate to the data, and how did you do that?
So I'm going to give you a partial answer there, and then I can tell you who to get in touch with for the rest of the answer. But I think that visualization was in Houdini, and that one is increasingly faithful to the equations that we're using. So we're using open foam is the 3D modeling that we're using to assess the waves, and we're putting some of those parameters into Houdini, is what I understand Ian is doing.
We have one question in the Zoom chat about maintenance costs for nature-based solutions, and if you could speak about maintenance costs of things like mangroves versus other concrete-type alternatives.
Yeah, so this is one of the areas that is assumed to be a huge benefit of nature-based solutions as natural infrastructure. And that is, if the Corps of Engineers builds a seawall or a bulkhead, and you're assessing the benefits and costs, you're including a maintenance schedule of costs into the future. You know that waves are going to move around the boulders on that breakwater or break down that seawall. I mean, if you've been along West Cliff Drive in Santa Cruz, you see they're at work every year in some of those sections of the seawall and the boulders on the seawall there. Those are really significant maintenance costs. If done well, mangroves and reefs can be self-healing. So you should be able to substantially reduce the maintenance costs using these kinds of natural features. We're still proofing that out in many places, but of course, I mean, these habitats have survived these environments for millennia, and they come back. And we've seen the comeback. I mean, you look at Southwest Florida there and the mangroves. There were impacts to those mangroves, and then we've seen over the past 30 years that it's about 4 years for recovery of mangroves. That's a lot shorter than a lot of what we're going to see, even with massive investment in the recovery of some of our hard infrastructure down there.
So I know that climate change is changing what kinds of organisms live farther north. Is this going to make mangroves more of a possibility for people closer to us, for areas closer to ours?
Some. So, I mean, we will see mangroves increasingly in Southern California, more than likely. So there is some possibility of that. One of the places that, actually they are actually beginning to facilitate some of this mangrove migration is near New Orleans, so in Louisiana. Louisiana is mostly marshes like we have here. But increasingly mangroves are moving into those environments, and mangroves are a better land builder than marshes. So they accumulate more sediments, they're taller, so they can essentially handle larger waves, as it were. So the expansion of mangroves in many places could be particularly beneficial. That's my cue.
Thank you very much, Mike, for that fascinating talk. The lecture tonight has been recorded and will be available on the UCSC YouTube channel. Please join us on December 7th for our next lecture with Professor Karen Mega. She'll be talking about her work in human genome sequencing. Good night, everyone.